Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here to review the movie Double Dragon. Ultimately, a movie that is double, but not plural. Okay? So, when going on into this movie, we have a cluster of interesting stars within this movie. More notably, we have Alyssa Milano, that ultimately is notably known from the show Who is the Boss. But ultimately, a lot of people might know her from her being the name of the ship on Guardians of the Galaxy. Evidently, the Milano was named after Alyssa Milano. So ultimately, the year after Double Dragon, Alyssa Milano had done the movie Embrace of the Vampire, which I think a lot of people might have known that she had done at some point. Reasonably, a lot of people through probably rentals and reviews or rentals and stuff like that later on after that movie came out, a lot of people are like, oh my god, Alyssa Milano in that movie, whoo. So reasonably, eventually you get it to where I had reviewed at some point Embrace of the Vampire, but I have to eventually probably re-review it at some point, but probably won't ever do that. Embrace of the Vampire is a story about a girl that is on campus, and eventually she is trying to be with a boyfriend, but then eventually that relationship ends up getting pulled apart because it seems that Alyssa's character is seemingly dreaming about this vampire, and eventually this vampire shows up, and it seems like this girl is just like, well, I guess I have to be with this vampire because I've been dreaming about him. So, and also the relationship with her other boyfriend gets pulled apart by some female vampire at some point. So, ultimately, kind of a Fright Night ish like movie, um, but maybe not the highbrow caliber of vampire movies at some point. So, Embrace of the Vampire, if you can probably find that somewhere, go ahead and check that out. But without a doubt, let's move on. Scott Wolf, a lot of people would probably mention Party of Five whenever they would probably hear the word Scott Wolf. Uh, we also have Mark Dacascos, who ultimately plays Jimmy Lee in this movie. I probably more notably remember him from, I believe, the Crow series, but other than that, I just quite can't quite remember anything else that he's been in. Robert Patrick, ultimately the guy who was the liquid metal Terminator in Terminator 2 Judgment Day. Ultimately, he was also in reasonably either Wayne's World as kind of the liquid Terminator, or reasonably he was also in one of the sequels to From Dusk Till Dawn, and probably been in a number of other projects as well. Also, notably, the John Cena Marine movie as well as the villain in that movie. So that's all that I really have to say about the cast. To dare, in fact, go and find them somewhere. But anyways, so Double Dragon. I like this movie because it's fun. I think for this one, the only real problems that I have is kind of the overuse of the villainous power, or just the overall use of the villain in this movie compared to everything else. And probably just really there isn't enough time to marinate on the whole Double Dragon thing. It seems like reasonably the whole Double Dragon thing is really just at the very tail end of the movie, and really it's just kind of as an afterthought of the film, reasonably. Uh, so going into this movie, there are some kind of very traditional ways of which you have to kind of break down this movie, because there's always like these traditional, like especially with a martial arts kind of movie, you have to like push these certain kind of themes, and this movie does that. So going on into this movie, I thought that it was funny and it was fun, and that's probably why it's probably on, like, still on my top 10 of movies, but it's probably on the very lowest rung. And at some points, there probably are probably just better movies than this one. Uh, but anyways, I really hold on to this one much more so than anything else because I think it was just one of those where it was done, where it was taken off of a Nintendo like game. So recently, I was like, you know what? Like, I'm not even like. There's some times where I just tie myself onto, okay, well, I liked this movie just because I thought it was cool that it was adapted from a game or a comic book or something like that. And I think that's where I usually hold on to movies much more so, even though the quality of them tends to go at some point. So that is all that I think I will go out of my way to say about this movie. And recently, I there are still points in this movie that you can just tend to laugh. There are some funny, joking points. It's very bizarre that it seems like they have to have this double dragon like world off in some distant future you where you have like a water that is just kind of unhealthy, or you have futuristic like gadgets of sorts that randomly appear in places. Uh, and also kind of a weird and bizarre, kind of interesting weather report. Uh, but again, you can't really tell exactly what time period this is. It isn't. It doesn't feel like a very severely distant future. It just kind of feels like odd items that are happening within this city. So going on to here, let's go into spoilers about this movie. That's otherwise dust out that double five to otherwise finish this review and just kind of find this whole thing interesting enough to do. So spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So Double Dragon. We open with this movie with the traditional. We have to find some ancient artifact from a very distant part of the world, and so ultimately we we have to where that Linda Lash, who ultimately is the seemingly assistant of Robert Patrick, ultimately going and finding one half of the double dragon. So ultimately, she ends up calling him up, just easily saying, "Oh yeah, we got the double dragon." It seems like there might have been a war breaking out, but who really knows? So pushing us on to a quick transition where we have seemingly Lee and the Lee brothers, both Billy and Jimmy, who are putting together a karate tournament, and ultimately they are very much supposedly ahead of their scoreboard, and so ultimately they are, because ultimately bizarrely they have a scoreboard of sorts showcasing this duo tournament of karate, and so ultimately we have it to where we push on to, it seems that we find Jimmy is much more of a planner and Billy is much more of a free spirit or much more spontaneous. And so we have it to where uh, when Billy kind of goes off and just kind of latches on or kind of rear like piggybacks onto his opponent and kind of gives them noogies and whatever. Uh, it ends up that Billy ends up disqualifying both Jimmy and Billy from the contest and having the other duo karate people win. To where ultimately you have Jimmy saying, it's like, well, dude, like, you just lost us this competition. You just lost us the prize money. And Billy's like, well, hey, like, you were playing it safe and I was trying to win. Like, not really. You're just goofing off. So ultimately, within this contest was running a little bit too late because ultimately Billy and Jimmy had to fight both of these fighters again when one of the fighters was holding up their trophy in front of their faces, making fun of them, and so they had to lash out yet again to to fight for their own honor. So we have it to where now Jimmy and Billy and now Satori are in the car, ultimately trying to beat curfew because it's that contest was running really late. Ultimately, we find within the city that we seem that there is some truce between the police officers and the gangs. Ultimately, when curfew hits, it seems that legitimately the gangs are all out to do their own equivalent of protecting and serving, protecting themselves, serving up some punishment. So we have it to where it seems that one of the gangs, the Mohawk gang or the Hawk gang, ends up pulling over the Lee brothers and Satori. So we have it within here that uh, this gang member, Abobo, is going to the car and asking for license and registration kind of thing, as if a cop would do this. And so ultimately, or Jimmy is mentioning that he left his driver's license in his other pants, and so ultimately, Abobo is looking at the medallion of which that Satori has. So it seems that Abobo is wanting to be after seemingly Satori's medallion, and Satori ends up telling Jimmy, it's like, floor it. So now we have a car chase in a martial arts film, and I'm confused. But I guess you can just kind of enjoy the futuristic car that otherwise has to be run on garbage or trash. Because we ultimately have at some point in this chase where the Lee brothers are grabbing as much trash as they can from a side part of trash under some bridge and shoving it within their vehicle to supposedly fuel their vehicle, kind of similar to Back to the Future with Christopher Lloyd, where at the end of that he's like tossing as much trash as he can into the DeLorean and then eventually shooting off where they don't need roads. So going on into here, we have it to where ultimately the Lee brothers are trapped with left there being without any road, which ultimately is going to have the Mohawk people corner the Lees, and ultimately now we have to have the Lee brothers fight it out. Ultimately, putting up a strong front, and ultimately we have to mention that seemingly a Bobo can lift seemingly over 350 pounds, which is like, okay, well, sure, okay. Supposedly he has the strength of 10 men. Okay, sure. So we have to where both Jimmy and Billy are getting ready to fight. Ultimately, Billy is asking Jimmy if, hey, like, do you have a plan? And Jimmy's like, well, I'm just working out the little details. In other words, meaning no. So Billy and Jimmy are just kind of standing and just kind of talking smack to the Mohawks and kind of gearing up for what could quite possibly be a fight. But then all of a sudden, every single seemingly Power Core member comes out of the woodwork to otherwise have the numbers be outnumbered for the Hawk gang to ultimately they bail out. Billy and Jimmy are like, yeah, we did it, but then ultimately they turn around to see a wall of graffiti that is completely matched within these Power Core members, as if they've as if they've been waiting hours to just camouflage themselves out of the distance, knowing full well that evidently this is a very popular uh, part of town that everyone goes into, and so ultimately that's where the Power Core can camouflage themselves hiding in graffiti, or maybe this graffiti is just everywhere in the world, and so easily they just can easily blend into everything. I don't know. So we have it to where the Power Core ends up helping out the Lee brothers, and the Lee brothers end up bailing, and this and that. The following day, we ultimately find Alyssa Milano's character putting on a wig, disguising herself, and ultimately her brother is bribing her to keep her secret. Ultimately, we have the chief of the police, who is actually Melissa Milano's father, who ultimately is Chief Delario. Sure. Uh, so we have the chief, who ultimately is kind of bad mouthing the Power Core. Ultimately, like mentioning how, uh, like they're not getting, like if anything, they're effing up like cases and stuff like that. And Alyssa's character is going out of her way to kind of mention, it's like, well, actually, I think the Power Core found some real evidence about this gang, and they're really helping out the city. And of course, she's like, nah, no, no. So we have it to where the we have to where Robert Patrick's character, uh, Dyson, ultimately getting the medallion, and now he has to consistently use this thing repetitiously. Every little chance he gets, he has to figure out how to use this medallion, how to be a Shadow Esh like character, and we also find out what Dyson's weakness is. It's seemingly light. Every time it seems that anyone turns the lights on, ultimately Dyson is uh, berating them because ultimately he uh, wasn't able to put his sunglasses on before they turned the lights on. So we have it within Dyson to consistently use this trick to kill whoever he needs to, or otherwise justify uh, using this trick for his own means. So right away, we have Robert Patrick, who is going to finally have to knock down some maniac leader who is getting word out from all the seemingly gangs that are around him that it seems that Dyson is uh, going to control everything, and ultimately he has some mind games or mind power to ultimately sway people to do whatever he wants. We have this maniac leader, Michael Bervman, who ultimately is just like if anything, he's not even gonna touch me. Like, no, there's no way that this guy is gonna be able to use his power on me. And we have it to where this maniac leader is demanding like almost Dyson's head at some point, and Dyson shows up. So Dyson ends up using his shadow power to choke this maniac leader and kill him, and to basically mention to all these gangs that the truce is over. the truce between the police and the gangs are over, and now um, Dyson is using every single number of these gangs to ultimately try and get the Lee brothers, because he knows full well where the other medallion is, which is with Satori. So we have it to where we have the Lee brothers and Satori in this bizarrish like headquarters. I would call it headquarters because it doesn't seem like anything else. It doesn't feel like a real home to me, because really this establishment is some movie theater that is kind of done as a all purpose kind of thing. It's a movie theater slash gym slash any number of things. And so recently, when looking at this, it's like, okay, this environment is kind of like a random all-purpose place, and this and that. So we we have in this we have, of course, Satari eventually breaking down to her sons, basically about the value of the medallion, and really that they should keep this with them, and because ultimately it seems that people are going to be looking for this now. So while that is going on, and this and that, we have this kind of like Satari, which we barely seemingly barely know her relationship. We ultimately have Dyson rolling in to ultimately come for the medallion. We also, at some point before this, we had Abobo, who had failed to get the medallion and had gotten the Lee brothers previously. So we have it to where Dyson ends up experimenting on Abobo and saying, like, well, hey, like, you're really strong right now, but I think you can be stronger, and you could be as strong as 10 men. And Abobo is like, well, I'm already stronger than 10 men. It's like, well, yeah, but you could be stronger. Ultimately, Abobo, Dyson says, is like, oh, ultimately, Abobo, you're like a son to me, but the only thing is I can make more sons. So, if anything, like, basically, Abobo needs to be even stronger to make sure that he is much more of a threat to anyone. So, Dyson comes in to talk to a Satori and is like, "Hey, where is the other medallion? I like I already have the other medallion, which he ultimately shows, because ultimately, you know, Satori says that it's like, well, the other medallion was like continents apart." And ultimately, it's like, oh, this medallion that you said is worlds apart? Not so much. So we have it to where Satori is telling Jimmy and Billy to run, ultimately having them just kind of run throughout this establishment, trying to climb up things and all these kind of ropes and such, to avoid these goons or these minions. We ultimately have Robert Patrick and Satori talking to one another, Dyson, kind of talking at some point of the past, where ultimately it seems that Dyson knew Satori's husband, uh, and so reasonably there is some kind of backstory, barely, kind of tying these people together at some point. So we have it where Dyson becomes Satori, and so when eventually the Lee brothers are kind of very busy trying to either run from eventually Abobo, that is now crashing his way through this movie theater slash all purpose place. We eventually have the Lee brothers making their way all the way back to Satori. Satori is uh, kind of now giving the guise of seemingly like, hey, give me the medallion, like I'll help you kind of thing, but really it's actually uh Kagashuko who or Dyson who is ultimately the culprit of being Satori, to the point where ultimately they have to lock her in a cage because it's Robert Patrick and not actually Satori. So they lock her away, and so with that problem, we have it to be where now Robert Patrick's character is going to light up this building. Is now going to burn it down, and so now the guys had otherwise locked Satori in this cage, and now they're pretty much going to have to say goodbye to her because she is going to burn alive in this place. She is going to have to die because justifiably she can't get out of this cage, and ultimately there is not enough time, and ultimately Billy and Jimmy need to keep the medallion safe. So they say their goodbyes and then they run off. They run off to eventually go into some boat esque like cabin uh, that ultimately is now eventually going to be swarming with gang members. People are seemingly flying out of the sky to try to otherwise get these people. We have even mailmen that are coming after these guys. And like everyone is like they have the goofiest looking gang people that are all coming after uh, seemingly the Double Dragons, or seemingly the Lee brothers. So we have to where eventually it seems like when Jimmy and Billy are both in this little cabin, at first they try to use a motorcycle, which doesn't work, which I'm like, yeah, because this motorcycle was probably like just garbage and just was like a weird thing that they probably had to like makeshift make for this, and then it completely fell apart as a joke. They ultimately go into trying to use some boat, but then they end up jumping out of the boat because the boat eventually explodes. So naturally, people just assess or assume that they are both dead because they were on this boat, but ultimately they fell into the water, which ultimately this water can, I guess, supposedly make people sick because this water is very unhealthy. It can probably have you be like, it can give you all kinds of sicknesses and such. So, if anyways, the real true crux of this story is the fact that now the brothers are one grieving their loss of their mother, but I think there is really starting to have like friction happen between the two because reasonably Jimmy is just like, God, we need to come up with another plan, and Billy's like, God, another plan, dude, that's all you do is just waste time planning away everything, and like we need to do something now, like we need to try to get something, we need to try to do something now. So that is where the friction is starting to happen between the brothers, and ultimately they're also just still just grieving the loss of their mother. So pushing them on to eventually having them forcibly needing to find the power core. And so they end up bizarrely easily finding these headquarters as if it's like written on some wall somewhere. Hey, power core is right here. Please, like come on in, come on down to the power core. So recently we have the Double Dragons or the Lee brothers go into a door that says use other door. Recently they're like, yeah, I guess this is the easy door to use, but it's not. It's actually a trap door that basically hauls them into these headquarters to be tossed into a dozen of Power Core members. Ultimately, Alyssa Milano is like, well, hey, why didn't you guys use the stairs? Ultimately, as a joke, to just like, oh yeah, the trick door wasn't actually the trick door; it's the right door. Anyway, so we ultimately have we ultimately have Billy and Jimmy telling the Power Core members their entire life story and basically telling them about the medallion and how it has a special ability. And ultimately, so of course, we have the entire time where they have to figure this special ability out and ultimately have it be that hey, maybe there's some magical incantation, or maybe there's some magic word that you have to say, or maybe you have to touch it the right way, or maybe you have to. So many times of which they have to kind of go into here and kind of figure out every single thing that could possibly activate this medallion. And so reasonably, we have it to where Jimmy and Billy are like, well, hey, maybe we like Billy is mentioning like, well, hey, maybe we need to like touch the medallion together, and maybe like that'll be the one thing to activate this. Because if anything, like Billy has been just been trying it on his own, but maybe he needs the help of another person. So ultimately, while touching the medallion with both Jimmy and Billy together, it sounds like something is happening. It sounds like something is working. It sounds like a sound that is coming from one of the Power Core members as a joke to make it sound like the medallion is actually working, but it's not. So yeah, you have to like kind of throw it in these people's faces that nothing that these people are going to do is actually going to have it work. So we have it to where Billy and Jimmy are desperately uh, asking Alyssa's character Moraine for help to ultimately go and break into Dyson's headquarters to ultimately go and get the other medallion. So of course, as per usual for every movie, when anybody sneaks into anything ever, you have it be that they have to, of course, sneak in through the ventilation shaft and to otherwise try and to get into the ventilation shaft of the office of Dyson. So within here, we have Dyson, who is now seemingly trying to bribe the chief of police because ultimately the chief is he is wanting to try to do what's right and ultimately like kind of telling people, hey, like make sure that you're home by curfew. You only have like 20 minutes. Make sure you're rolling and showing and going and whatever. We also on the news reports have kind of very weird like news reports going on within this movie. Ultimately, Andy Dick is a weatherman that is telling us that they're gonna get acid rain, which ultimately I'm like, dude, I only know that in like African rainforests, but I guess that's the part of this bizarrish distant future where we now have acid rain being a concern, and also we have some kind of new weird news reports at some point going on here. But anyways, ultimately done by I think Vanna White and George. Hey, John Malkovich is in this film. I didn't know that. So is Gilbert Godfrey, I guess. But anyways, how is Matt Damon in this film? Good God, is there just a lot of random people? Edward Norton is in this film. Uh, yeah, that doesn't quite seem right. It seems like the people mentioned in this film, I can't believe are actually in this film. Um, but anyways, so yeah, so going on to here, we have a ventilation shaft, and now bizarrely we have a necklace that has to be turned into a weighing down like a weighing down a string item that is held that is at the end of it a pen that ultimately has to try to get this necklace. This necklace and pendant thing, it keeps jumping up and down to where the point of like even Linda Lash is ultimately noticing that ultimately this thing is going up and down. The chief of police even notices that it's jumping up and down. So Linda eventually gets a spear from some statue and ultimately just kind of stabs what is the ventilation shaft, ultimately having Jimmy, Billy, and Alyssa's character all fall through the ventilation shaft. Ultimately, we have the chief of police realizing that his own daughter is from the power cord, and he's like, "Oh my god, my daughter!" So we recently have these three people all who can no longer get the medallion because it is in Dyson's hand. Uh, Dyson is, of course, trying to seemingly going to use this power and doesn't, of course, use it on the chief. We have to where the Lee brothers and Moraine ultimately are running off into some laboratory where Abobo was tested on earlier to make him a strain, ultimately making him a Stay Puft Marshmallow Man that ultimately Alyssa talks about as he referenced to let you know exactly what this character looks like. So ultimately throwing to her that Alyssa Milano had also been in the Ghostbusters video game, so I guess that's why she gave that reference, because she's a big Ghostbusters-like fan. So, man, Alyssa Milano, just thumbs up all around. So, and she was also in the Ghostbusters video game, which happened years later, which that was great. So, we have it to where, whew, we have to where now in this movie the laboratory where it seems that we have a lot of dead bodies. It seems like we have some interesting characters who are dead, and justifiably the Lee brothers and Alyssa's character Moraine don't know why these corpses are all there, but eventually we can easily figure it out because Robert Patrick ultimately has been a character that has consistently cracked his knuckles consistently, and so now we seemingly have a basketball-esque like character that is very tall and big, ultimately now on the crux of leaning up against the Lee brothers and telling them it's like, yeah, I'm gonna kill you. So we have it seemingly easily and all that to just have a lever easily being pulled to drop down some wall onto this basketball player, ultimately leaving Dyson to be a shadow that is still going to end up in some other body, into some other corpse. We ultimately have Alyssa and Billy who make their way onto that wall that had fallen down to ultimately see if they could escape this said headquarters, or at least be able to hide from Dyson for a period of time. Jimmy doesn't quite get to be able to get onto that wall, and so easily he falls into having to fight Dyson and ultimately gets headbutted and knocked out. So ultimately, Billy is like, "Oh my god, I can't do anything without my brother," and Moraine is just like, "Well, the one thing that we need to do is we need to find our way out of here. We need to regroup." So Billy and Alyssa end up regrouping at the Power Core headquarters. We have to where Alyssa is trying to like still figure out how to help Billy figure out this medallion, ultimately asking if there's any magical words that he still needs to say, or maybe if there is some kind of bizarrish lettering and or Sanskrit or something like that that is in the back of the medallion. Maybe there is a phrase that he needs to say. Maybe because radios would tell you like, "Hey, what's the phrase that pays?" So really, there is no wordages or anything like that, words that are on the back of this medallion. And so, reasonably, Billy's at a loss for words how to figure out this medallion, and so we have to where Jimmy is seemingly coming back to the headquarters. It seems like he is unharmed, and so Billy is like, "Yeah, you're back," and really not quite, really not quite back, uh, because ultimately we have to where seemingly all these gangs get unleashed within the this headquarters. It's an all-out brawl. Everybody's fighting, and then eventually, seemingly Jimmy appears out of nowhere to take down both of these gang members. And then Billy is like, "Oh, Jimmy, you're back!" But and there, in fact, it's not actually Jimmy. It's Patrick or Robert Patrick's character, Dyson's character, controlling Jimmy. So we have to have it be to where Dyson is taking out Billy and or Jimmy is taking out Billy, and we get to one point where there is a bunch of arcade like games that are displayed to where we even have the Double Dragon arcade game. And so now like we're having Jimmy just kind of break all these arcades, just arcade games, destroying them, which I thought was kind of fun. And then so eventually we have to where Billy is desperately like talking to the medallion. It's like, hey, if there was ever an emergency, this would be a perfect time to help me out here. And so it just gets to the point where Billy is even more and more frustrated with the medallion because it's not activating, it's not helping him. And so reasonably, it just gets to the point where Billy gives up on the medallion, tosses it aside, and it's like, you know what, if you're not going to help me, then like forget you then. And he throws away the medallion, and the medallion comes back to him, and it is now finally activated to where it supposedly is helping him, to where Jimmy tosses Billy through this brick wall, and to where Billy is completely unharmed. And then Jimmy, who is ultimately still Dyson, is ultimately like, well, I guess I can't hurt you now, but if anything, I can hurt Jimmy. I can kill him. So here's where we have this classic, hey, something is tied with rope that is ultimately, if this rope is undone, is going to quite possibly kill somebody, because that's what happens in every single film, especially during a certain time period where it's like, hey, if you put a flame upon some rope and eventually it unravels, this person is going to fall to their death. Oh no, you have movies like that all the time. So we have it to where Jimmy is pulling the rope that ultimately is going to usher down this heavy boxing bag that must be 1,000,000 pounds, I guess. I don't think that's really going to kill anybody, but we have it to where we have it to where Billy tosses Jimmy out of the way, and Billy takes the blow. And so now we just have to have Billy man up and start beating the crap out of his own brother. And it ends up that Jimmy ends up grabbing the medallion from Billy and ends up tossing it away. Billy ends up beating the crap out of Jimmy, and then we had this whole joke within this early portion of this movie where the Mohawk gang, when ultimately they were in their vehicle chasing after the Lee brothers, ultimately the first time they called them Lee brothers, and ultimately the smartass character that was with Abobo was mentioning like, hey, like these guys are UGG and they're home. And ultimately, you got a Bobo that's like, oh, well, yeah, like one's ugly and one's homely. Because they're the Lee brothers. And so, recently, you have this joke coming back again, uh, or for probably the third or eighth time in this movie, towards the end of this movie, where Jimmy calls Billy ugly. And so that is the cue to say that Dyson is now out of Jimmy's body. And so what ends up happening is Dyson as a shadow is going after the medallion and ultimately end up getting both medallions together, and people are like, holy and he's like, you bet. And so ultimately we get the medallions clash together, and ultimately this just unleashes two minion looking guys that otherwise are fighting as a shadow. And ultimately when the guys try to use like golf clubs to try to fight these sword wielding guys, none of it works, because basically they're shadows, and only and they can ultimately try to cut the dragons. They can cut the Lees, but ultimately the Lees can't do anything to them. But recently they just outmaneuver and outsmart both of these Shadow Edge like characters, kind of smashing them back together, ultimately kicking off both medallions from them to ultimately be in the hands of the Lee brothers. And now the brothers are like, hey, yeah, now we're going to put the medallions together. And of course that's when of course you get Dyson going, oh, and like that's when the brothers like, you bet, and they put the medallions together in a very Power Rangers morphing like sequence to completely change the double dragons or double dragon into into now wearing these red and blue outfits. Ultimately, Jimmy has to crack wise about otherwise, saying that it's like, oh, thank God I didn't get blue, and Billy's like, what's wrong with blue? So recently this is like a victory lap, basically saying, hey, like we now finally became the Double Dragons. So now all that we have to do now is just easily take out this Dyson character who isn't strong enough to really take us down. And so recently all that we have to do now is jump into his body and wait for the cops to arrest him when the cops come into this Power Core headquarters. So recently, that just kind of easily wraps up the movie. I know Alyssa kind of does some jabs here and there with Linda Lash. We ultimately have it to where Alyssa at some point does this weird, bizarre like punch maneuver to Linda, which ultimately takes her out supposedly. And I'm like, okay, that doesn't look like a punch to punch anybody. Like, I guess it looks like an uppercut, but to me, it looks like she is like punching the air. Like, it doesn't look like the punch is landing anywhere. And I thought that the punch was really goofy looking. But I guess it might have looked like it landed, but it didn't to me. Uh, Plus, also, eventually, it seemed like Linda Lash ended up getting like a freaking elbow or forearm for her troubles and knocking her out. So, but eventually we have it to where Dyson is Jimmy talking into Dyson is giving a check to the police force as a donation, and also he is uh, really just kind of making fun or slapping himself and all kinds of weird, goofy things. So, and ultimately asking the chief to arrest him. Ultimately, the chief does. And so we have it to where Jimmy gets out of the body of Dyson. And so Dyson is like, well, hey, like, I want that check back. I didn't write that check. And ultimately, he is asking, it's like, oh, if you think I'm bad, just wait till you hear my lawyers, as he's carted off to go to prison because supposedly the police night shift have finally rolled in, because the chief is desperately wanting any of his co-workers to go and fight crime with him, and no one will, to where ultimately he gets in his own car to fight crime, and no one, like, everybody's like, well, you then, nah, whatever. So he ends up going alone to be a lone gunman to arrest Dyson. and but then all the other police at the very last second are like, "Hey, we're the night shift. We're coming. We're helping." So we end up having this nice little neat little ending where ultimately we find that the Lee brothers' car has now been redone to look like there's dragons on the sides of the car. And now we have a Bobo that's like, "Hey man, I'm kind of bored. How about I just drive your car for you?" And so now we have the tail ending of this where it seems that if Billy and Alyssa's character weren't trying to kiss before, it seems like Jimmy and Alyssa's character were trying to get their own alone time, which ultimately was interrupted by Billy, and then the car goes careening off, and that's how the movie ends. So, yeah, I thought that this movie was fun. I thought there were some goofy moments in this movie. Uh, but yeah, it's a movie that, yeah, I just kind of wish that Double Dragon was done as a series. I think that there's enough really there. Like when you look at stuff like the stuff that Marvel did, that like the Runaways or Cloak and Dagger, I'm like, why can't Double Dragon actually be a show? Like I think there is enough there to, even if they do the video, they rip it off, they adapt it from the video game, or there's not much story there. I think really the only story to really crux on is really the brothers. I think at some point there probably was an animated series of the Devil Dragons, but I don't think that really lasted all that long. But I would like to eventually see that as well, to just kind of see like what happened with that. But anyways, that's all I have to say about Double Dragon. Really an interesting movie, but at the end of the day, I could say that it was a fun film. But that's all I could say. So I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.